There once was a couple who were without child. No matter what they did, no matter how they tried, no herbs that they used, they could not bear a child. Now the mother, in her frustration, threw up her hands and said, "Oh, if I could only just have a sprig of myrtle, I would be satisfied with just that." 9 months later, instead of delivering a baby child, she delivered a sprig of myrtle into the midwife's hands. She took this myrtle and she put it in a pot and she watered it and spoke to it and spent so much time loving it. She put it on the windowsill, and there the mother became happy with her lot in life again. Now it so happened that there was a prince. There's always a prince who was passing by the cottage, and he saw in the window a pot with a sprig of myrtle. He came round to the door, knocked on the door, and asked the woman, would he sell her this pot, this myrtle, this beautiful little sapling? And after some time, the mother submitted to the prince's request. She said, "You must look after her. I love her as much as I would a human child. Please care for her." The prince got his helpers to carry the pot with reverence and care back to his castle, where he placed it on his windowsill. And he had water for it, and he spoke to it, and he spent time loving this little sprig of myrtle. One night, when the prince was asleep, he heard the footsteps inside his room. And after this happened for 7 days, he needed to find out. He reached out his hand into his bed, and he didn't find a blanket. He found instead a soft, warm body. And every night for a week, he reached out to find this soft, warm body. And he needed to find out. His desire was deep to know who this thing was in his bed. So one night, he took a lock of her hair and tied it to his finger, and lit a candle and held it over her so she couldn't run away. And when he saw, he fell in love. She was the most beautiful, angelic, wondrous being he had ever seen. And she woke up and she looked at him, and they shared a tender moment. He could not believe that someone with such beautiful eyebrows, soft skin, luscious lips, and flowing, long, beautiful hair would be in his bed. The prince, of course, had many suitors, many women who wanted to be for him. But it was this fairy, the fairy in his bed that chose. He chose, and she chose him. They professed their love to each other. He offered her his scepter, and she accepted. And they made promises to each other and were married in the presence of his chamber. And of course, as it is with all things, the prince was called away to go hunting. There was a wild boar in the forest, and he would be gone 3 days. And he said to his fairy, "You must return to the pot in my absence. I cannot have anything happen to you. I cannot have anyone find out about you. We are not ready. Please go into the pot." And she loved him so much that she did. But she said, "Tie a little string to the top of my leaves with a little bell, and when you come back, ring the bell and I'll come out and say, 'I'm here.'" They said their farewells, the prince went off on a 3-day hunt, and the princess, or the fairy Myrtle, went back to her pot. Remember those old suitors that I spoke about before? Well, there were 7 of them. 7 women who wanted the attentions of this prince. They wanted to become queen. They had engaged the services of some workmen who dug a tunnel from their house up into the prince's chamber. And while he was gone, they turned up in his chamber. They at once saw this beautiful sprig of myrtle and started ripping the leaves off it. The youngest took the top of the leaves off, and as she did so, the bell rang and the fairy came out and was presented in front of these women. They tore her to shreds. So when the chamberlain came to make the bed and water the plants as the prince had instructed him to do, he found this broken plant on the ground. He picked up the soil and repotted it the best he could. When the prince returned, he was furious that his beautiful plant had been damaged. And he called the chamberlain in and said, "You should not have done this. I asked you to look after my plant." And he threw the chamberlain out. "Get out of my sight," he said. And the prince fell into a heap, fell into a deep, deep grief. He could not bear the thought of his beautiful fairy being so broken. He didn't eat for days, for weeks. He grew pale and thin. Nothing could rouse him from his bed. He was broken and sobbing. One morning, he felt a tap on the shoulder and looked up to see his beautiful fairy restored. He couldn't believe it. He threw his arms around her and covered her in kisses. She was back. He asked her who had done this to her, and she told him of the 7 women who had come in when he was not here and ripped her to shreds. She said it wasn't the chamberlain's fault. The chamberlain was called and the prince forgave him. But he at once decided that he would really marry this fairy legitimately. He told his father, and a celebration began. There was feasting, and he invited specifically the 7 women who had damaged his fairy. The feasting went on for days. It was a beautiful celebration. And when he stood up to do a speech, the prince spoke about how his beautiful Myrtle fairy had been damaged, and he asked each one of the servants in his kingdom to name exactly how they should be punished. Some thought they should be hung. Some thought the thumb torture. Others thought they should be thrown off a cliff. And when it came to the 7 women, they, after being plied with drink, said they should be buried alive in a dungeon. The prince said, "You have now sealed your fate, for it is you who have hurt my fairy. Take them away." And the 7 women were taken to a dungeon where it is said they didn't live for very long. Of course, the prince and the fairy were very happy in their kingdom, and the prince was so happy to have his fairy out in the world and not hidden anymore. Everyone knew that she and he were together. He sent for her parents, who never wanted for anything ever again, and they lived happily ever after.